Enjoy being up here at MTSU, the alma mater of one of my heroes, Jim Buchanan, and I studied under him in graduate school, the Nobel laureate, and he recently deceased. I saw they still don't have his death date out here on the marker for him, so he's still alive here at MTSU, so that's very nice. And what I want to talk to you tonight is when Jason invited me to come, he said, I want you to talk about some of the stuff you do in sports economics. And when I was speaking to a college level audience, I thought, well, given the topics I'm working on, a paper I've been looking at had to deal with paying college athletes. And you may not be aware of this, and some of you might be, that recently college athletics, or I should say colleges themselves, are allowed to pay their athletes a very small amount called a cost of attendance stipend. And this is something that was new this past year, and it largely, although it affects all sports, the big focus was initially on football, and football offers an opportunity to look at the effect that this had. So I want to take a look at what happened when colleges were allowed to pay their athletes, pay their football players a very small amount, and what that resulted in. And sort of a big thing is, did it affect where they were going to school? Because if you look at a lot of quotes out there of people in the media saying, oh, well, it has no effect on it. College students go to school where they want to go to school. Well, on the margin, though, did it impact where they're going to school? And I know that it had an effect here at MTSU. I'm not sure if they decided they're going to do it next year, or even if they did do it last year. Do you have any football players in here? Or athletes? Do any of y'all get cost of attendance?
Not football, but no, I'm a baseball player. But
no cost of attendance. And so I know that it was a big issue here because your coach actually turned down a raise to help try and pay for cost of attendance stipend. That was just the football coach. So maybe not for the baseball team, but and baseball is a whole different sport. Did I see someone else with a hand raised? And
basketball.
And do y'all get cost of attendance? So MTSU has not decided to do that, and the question is, how is that going to affect recruiting? Maybe some students are not going to go to MTSU because they might be able to get a cost of attendance stipend somewhere else. So, and I've actually got some numbers up here from Conference USA. I don't have MTSU's number because they did not report their data this year, so we don't exactly know what it is. But let's go back and start sort of why we have this unique industry in college athletics of players playing for the love of their school, generating lots of money but not getting paid for it, and where that comes from. And just so you know about my speaking style, if you see something up here and you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand. If you don't see me, say, excuse me, and I'll let you talk. I don't mind if you interrupt me. But I'll also stop a little bit early and be happy to take your questions. So let's briefly start here with an introduction to why is it that college athletes don't get paid? And the early days of college athletics and where they were being paid actually is in football. And you think of the earliest games, thinking back to Harvard versus Yale and these epic matches. And, college football has largely been about people getting together to go back to their alma mater to have an excuse to have a fun party. That was a lot of activities going on before the game, during the game. And these games were, while they were scheduled, weren't just athletic contests like we think of high school contests. So you play high school basketball, we're going to go play another high school, all the parents of all the players on the team go, a few friends go, and that's who all goes. It was always been driven by alums. And to give you an example, so I know we're in Tennessee, but let's think of a big rivalry. I often talk about this in Georgia. So the oldest rivalry in college football is the University of Georgia versus Auburn. And right now, every year, one year they play it in Athens and one year they play it in Auburn. Does anyone know where the game has been played more than anywhere else? Columbus, Georgia. You may have thought Atlanta's been played there a few times. Why is it Columbus, Georgia? Well, Columbus, Georgia is quite close to both Auburn, or people in Alabama, as well as Georgia. It's a great place for people to travel because it was a moneymaker. That's where the most people would go and see the game. You get Georgia fans and Auburn fans in there and have it on a neutral site. So in the early days, when the only way you could make money off the game was to have people show up and pay for a ticket rather than television rights, radio rights, to these other things, college athletics was largely affected by the drive to make money. And how much athletes were paid, normally you're getting ringers and saying, oh, this person plays for my school or doesn't play for my school. And there was just some corruption in that. And people who were involved in academics said this is a pure pursuit. What we need are amateurs to play this sport. So in 1948, the NCAA adopts what is known as the Sanity Code. It's just called that. And the idea is that we've got to make sure that our athletes are amateurs. And I have up here a quote I'm not going to read it. Feel free to read it if you want to. But I just pulled this off the website yesterday. And I think it speaks very strongly as to the goals behind the Sanity Code, is that we want to view athletes as students first. And that is their primary goal, is to come to college to be students, to earn an academic degree. And anyone who pays close attention to college sports knows that this is not the primary focus. So when do we see games? We see games now weeknights. NCAA tournament is taking up a lot of time. You know, it clearly is about the athletes themselves, not just the students. And in fact, students schedule their classes around their practice schedules, and that happens quite a bit. I don't have a problem personally with it. I just don't know why we talk so much about this student-athlete concept. And it just so happens that the NCAA gets a very big benefit from this, or say NCAA school members, and that is they have students who come and play for them. They generate revenue for them, for the school, and then the colleges, because they've all agreed not to pay the athletes, don't have to pay them. Seems kind of nice, right? You can have someone come over, work in your house, and you can't pay them. You're barred from paying them. So this has been the model up until really last year, that the only way you could pay a player was in the form of an academic scholarship. And academic scholarship was limited to some certain things I'll talk about in a second. I want to talk about why this move from amateurism is starting to shift, and talk about that shift in particular. Why are they getting paid at all now? So let's take a look at some numbers here, and let's look at college football as a business. And you can talk about this with other sports as well. And if you want to talk about sports that make money at school, basically there are two college sports that make money. That is college football and men's college basketball. Some women's programs do make money, and I'm not saying that other programs don't at different schools. For example, University of Tennessee, the women's basketball program has turned a profit, so it's a very successful program. But right now, and I'm just going to talk about Division 1A right here, although a lot of schools outside of the FBS Division 1A are also paying stipends. We've got about 129 football programs. I say about because there's some discrepancy. Some people say 128. We really got about 130. And the reason is that UAB dropped out and they came back. So do you count UAB as a football program or not? So we got around 130 football programs. The total revenue that is taken in by all of these Division 1A programs, FBS programs, is about $3 billion. So that's quite a sum of money. And if you want to break that down by school, that's about $75 million per school in revenue. But I want you to also take a look at how imbalanced this is. So I separated this out into the top 20 teams and the top 5 teams in college sports. I'm just looking at, these are college football revenues only. So about the top 20 teams earn about $1.5 billion total. That's about half. So you have 130 schools, 20 of them are earning half of that revenue. In fact, if you go and look at most college football programs, they're not making money. I haven't looked at it, but I'm pretty sure that MTSU's football program is not generating enough revenue to cover the cost of operating that program. Now, why is it that these schools continue to operate it if they're not making money? Well, we're a nonprofit institution, right? We have goals that are consistent with promoting education. Does football promote education? Well, maybe it promotes some collegiality, brings the type of students we want. The students who pay tuition to come here want to have a football team. And when we say it's losing money, remember, some of that money is coming from student fees. So students are choosing to go to a school like MTSU because they have a football team. At the institution where I teach, Kennesaw State University, some of you may be familiar with it. It's basically in metropolitan Atlanta. I don't know why it's named Kennesaw State University. It's a pretty poor name, especially when people confuse it with Kent State and Kansas State all the time when you say KSU. 33,000 students in football-loving country, Georgia, and we didn't have a football team. And so we adopted one. We said we've got to have a football team because our students want one. Students were saying, I want to go to Georgia State. Georgia has a football team. Maybe I'll go there, but I couldn't get into Georgia. Well, should I go to Georgia State or Kennesaw State? Well, Georgia State has a football team. Maybe I'll go there. And so Kennesaw State felt like it was something that the students demanded. In fact, the students actually voted at Kennesaw State to raise fees on themselves to pay for football. When I say pay for themselves, the people who voted have already graduated, so maybe they decided to impose it on future students. But certainly it was most of the funds that are coming to fund college football, or all college athletics, come from student fees. And most sports don't earn revenue. So you think about something like lacrosse. A lot of schools add lacrosse. Lacrosse certainly isn't earning a profit. Is a swim team turning a profit? How about a gymnastics team? Well, part of the reason is that you get the type of students who you think are going to be connected to the school. These students are more likely to graduate from your school. I mean, contrary to popular belief, athletes are normally better students than non-athletes. They're more likely to graduate. And there's some reasons for that have nothing to do with being a good student, but in many sports, particularly that are sports that are not the big ones like football or basketball, you're getting students who are going to participate, love the school, and may give something back in the future. And so a lot of schools, for example, where I used to teach just down the road in Sewanee, Tennessee, Division III, they continue to add sports, and they don't even offer athletic scholarships. It costs them money to travel and pay. So a lot of it is advertising and trying to offer services that students want. Now, breaking this down further, so let's take it to the top 5 teams. And so what I did was I took what Forbes says are the top 5 most valuable teams in college sports. It may not be the top 5 revenue teams, but it's about $95 million. And that's averaged over the past 5 years. So it's really probably best to say $100 million or a little bit over $100 million. And again, each school is taking in about $95 million a year in revenue. The BCF playoff rights. Every year, ESPN pays the BCS schools $470 million. That's just revenue for televising all the BCS bowl games in the college football playoffs. The SEC generated $527 million last year. That's quite a bit of money. Again, these sports are big business, which is sort of leading to where I'm going with this. Why are we paying college athletes right now? And at the bottom here, I list a court case that's going on right now, which is O'Bannon versus the NCAA. Now, Ed O'Bannon was a basketball player, played at UCLA. I believe his team won the national championship, or at least they played for it. And one day he was playing a video game, an EA game, NCAA basketball. And he saw that he was on it. They had his face on an avatar on a screen that was dunking the basketball. And he said, how on earth can UCLA use my likeness and make money off this? Look at all this money. I didn't put basketball revenue up here because I'm talking about football, but the revenue that's come from the NCAA tournament is, and actually that's a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar contract as well. The students aren't getting any of that. Because of the sanity code, teams or colleges are not allowed to pay their players. And this seems rather odd. So let's say you're an art student at MTSU and you have some artwork for your class. You're here, you're learning about art, you paint a picture, you have an art gallery show, an alum comes and says, look, I'm going to give you $10,000 for that painting. That's perfectly acceptable, perfectly legal. College football player goes out, makes a great catch, scores a touchdown, team wins the game. I'd like to give you a $100 handshake. No, that's not allowed. Both of them are doing good things that represent the school well, but the NCAA says that that's not allowed. And so O'Bannon represents a group of students who've banded together to sue the NCAA. And not this past summer, but the summer before, they actually sued and won in court. And the judge said, the NCAA is violating antitrust practices, and you're going to have to start paying players a certain amount, and it was just for things like video game rights. So the initial judge said you had to have a stipend that would be paid every year of no more or no less than $5,000, depending on which news report you read about it. No one can seem to agree what it was. But regardless, the appeals court turned down that verdict. It's still up for appeal, and it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, in which case O'Bannon still won the case, which gives students some more leverage in bargaining. And if you look at the history of collective bargaining and trying to argue for player rights, if you go and look at baseball, where Major League Baseball players tried to get bargaining rights with their teams as a labor union, it didn't start out with all of a sudden we went from not having free agency where players could shop their services to any team in baseball to free agency, where after 6 years of Major League service, they can shop themselves and earn large amounts of money as free agents. It happens slowly over winning arbitration decisions, court decisions, losing some court decisions, and getting some popular opinions. And so this is the first step, probably in many, that is going to lead to college athletes being paid. But for the time being, this explains where we are in getting the cost of attendance stipends. A lot of schools were looking at this, and they were looking at these same numbers that we're looking at here, $3 billion. How can you say the schools are not benefiting from this on the backs of the players? And a few people at a few schools decided, if we don't throw the players a few crumbs here and there, and the judge in the case had also suggested something like this, you need to cover, we're going to start covering the full cost of attendance. Now, what does we mean by a cost of attendance stipend? So let me talk about the origins of it. So previously, the Sanity Code, when it was first started out, is that you were not actually allowed to be given even an athletic scholarship, period. We just want students. If you're given a scholarship, that's fine. But then, it just happened to be that guys with great jump shots and poor grades were getting academic scholarships. We just said, fine, okay, we're going to go ahead, we're going to start giving athletic scholarships, but no more. And those scholarships were limited to tuition, room and board, and books. Now, a lot of you, when you were students, you may have looked at the cost of attendance of going to MTSU. And if you go, I went to your website a few days ago to look at this, and the cost of attendance to go to MTSU is somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000, depending on where you are, in-state, out-of-state. You live with your parents, not live with your parents. And this is a figure that is developed by the Financial Aid Office to give you some advice. It also advises the IRS and the Student Loan Corporation. How much is this person allowed to take out in a student loan so they can live in college for acceptable means? And the cost of attendance number includes not just tuition, room and board, and books, but it also includes some travel and miscellaneous living expenses. So in January of 2015, really almost out of nowhere, this really wasn't expected to be on the agenda, the Power 5 conferences, which includes just 65 schools, and we take the SEC, ACC, Pac-10, Big 12, Big 10, plus Notre Dame. Notre Dame gets to be all by itself as part of the Power 5. Maybe the Power 5 plus 1, as they should call it, or Notre Dame and the Power 5 be a better music group. And they agreed that they were going to start paying their players a cost of attendance, or the full cost of attendance is what this is called. So previously that was not allowed. The stage for this was set a year or two earlier when the NCAA voted to give the Power 5 conferences, or the autonomy group as they're sometimes known, the power to set their own rules, because they basically said, we're making a lot of money, we need to set our rules. Schools that weren't in the Power 5 were setting rules for their own benefit, and the schools were saying, we're going to end up having to leave the NCAA unless we get our way. So after they approved this, any school in the NCAA could also offer full cost of attendance stipends. Now, the vote for full cost of attendance stipends among the Power 5 was not unanimous. 64 schools voted for it, 1 voted against it. Anyone want to guess who voted against cost of attendance?
Notre Dame.
Nope, Boston College. It's a good guess. Boston College. Who knows? Maybe because Notre Dame voted for it, they voted against it. I don't know. That seems like a BC thing to do. Just seems like a rather arbitrary thing to do. Like, how much of a jerk are you? You can't give college students a few extra bucks. And I'm going to show you some numbers up here to show you how much those stipends are, because really what you're looking at somewhere, some schools have it down as low as in the low $1,000, all the way up to $7,000. Normally you're looking at somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000 when you're looking at these cost of attendance stipends. So it's not a very large sum of money in the grand scheme of things. Now, again, as I put on here, and I want you to take a look, so you got this travel and miscellaneous, and I'll talk about how this is used a little bit. But this number is not determined by the athletic department. It's determined by the Financial Aid Office. And the Financial Aid Office is supposed to say, here's how much it costs to go to MTSU. But the Financial Aid Office isn't told, here's exactly what you have to do. It's just, here's a guideline. Because everyone knows that all schools are different. Going to school in Murfreesboro is different than going to school in Knoxville or in Memphis. Therefore, the University of Memphis, University of Tennessee, MTSU, UT Chattanooga, they have their own cost of attendance numbers. And these have been set for years to guide students who are thinking about how much money do I have to take to go to school if I'm going to take out a loan, or if a scholarship is going to be given. Sometimes a full scholarship will include the additional miscellaneous and travel amounts that are allowed or calculated as part of the full cost of attendance. Well, let's think about what incentives this might create for schools and college athletics, and think about how much money is being made here. So this is a quote from an economist, Charles Clodfelter at Duke, and he wrote this book a few years ago. It's a neat little book on big-time sports at American universities. And one of the things he talks about are the incentives to win. One of the things that we've discovered in sports economics is, for the most part, winning begets more revenue. And even though universities aren't revenue maximizers in the sense that there's no profit that can be taken home, they still want to win. If I'm an athletic director, I want my team to win. Why? Because if I don't win, then I'm going to hear from the alums, I'm going to hear from the president, I might hear from legislators. And if you don't think that's a big deal, how tight it is to the legislature, recently, last week, Georgia was finishing up its legislative session. Kirby Smart, the new coach of the University of Georgia, went and happened to meet with a whole bunch of legislators. By the end of the night, an amendment was tacked to a bill that now allows state universities to take up to 90 days to meet Freedom of Information Act requests. Everyone else in the state, everyone else even at the university outside the athletic department, has 3 days. I used to be a department chair. These are not fun when you have to do a FOIA request. Basically, you have to stop everything and do it. And it was a burden to the athletic department, and it's millions of dollars. They couldn't hire someone to do it. And I think really the real reason behind it is that schools were trying to get secret information on each other. And Kirby Smart said, when I was in Alabama, we had this other rule that we didn't have to deal with this at Alabama. Goes to the legislator, boom. Believe me, legislators get calls about that. Why is it, why can't we hire an additional special teams coach? That's something, people want to hear about it, whether you went to the school or not. But these are the incentives here that I want to talk about. If you can figure out a way to use cost of attendance as stipends to get ahead, then maybe you can get some of those marginal recruits. Now, if any of you follow college football recruiting, I'm not someone who follows college football recruiting. And this paper that I'm telling you some of the results about, I wrote with a colleague of mine who's a huge college recruiting buff. And he's written some papers on college recruiting and what are the factors that are involved in it. And you go to a site like Rivals.com, and there are people who spend their lives evaluating high school players and saying, how good they're going to be. And people look out at the beginning of the year, and they don't just say, we won the national championship. They'll say, we're number 2 in the recruiting rankings. And that's good to telling everyone 3 and below, but number 1, you don't have that on them. So you hear a lot of people talk about these recruiting rankings. So they're very important. How can we use this cost of attendance to generate getting better students who are going to be athletes who are going to help us win more games? Now, in a private market, let's think about a football team. So the Tennessee Titans decide they want to have a better football team. They might say, we need to sign some better players. We're going to have to spend money on free agents. And you're willing to spend money on free agents until it's equivalent to the value that that player brings to your team. So if you go and you sign a player, and that player helps you gain additional yards or stop yards, which helps your teams win more games, fans are going to be more interested, they watch more games, it increases your revenue. You will be willing to pay that player up to what economists call their marginal revenue product. That is the additional revenue that their performance brings to the business operation, if you want to think about it rather casually. So if this school is earning $95 million, and you can bring in that one player who is really going to make your team. So think about this, and a perfect example of this is Cam Newton. So my colleague, actually, who I wrote this paper with, is a huge Mississippi State fan. And I don't know if you know the story about Cam Newton going to Auburn, but basically Cam Newton was pretty much committed to going to Mississippi State until it turns out that his father got a timely donation from Auburn for about $200,000. Well, my colleague was very upset about this. He goes, if I knew they only wanted to pay him $200,000, I would have given him some more money. He wanted to win a national championship. He thought that Mississippi State got screwed. So $95 million, you have that one player who will put you over the top. And if you remember watching that season with Cam Newton, he put Auburn over the top. He was worth millions of dollars to Auburn University. So what if I can figure out a way to throw a few bucks someone's way? The incentives are there. And just I also want to throw out another number here. A few years ago, when Florida became ineligible due to recruiting violations, they missed a bowl game. It cost them $2 million. So on the margin, not having that player to get you to a bowl game, even going to get you that 6 wins, you could be bowl eligible. It can be very lucrative for you because there are big payouts for playing in these bowl games, because bowl games like teams to come because their fans come and spend lots of money. So let's talk about these incentives and the room for mischief here. So these are some quotes from 2 players here, 2 coaches, one former, at the time they were both SEC coaches. And Mark Richt was at the University of Georgia, and last year before the season started, and if you're not that familiar with college football, Mark Richt was fired after the season. One of the most successful college football coaches in the past 15 years. His winning record was as high as anyone. He never could get over that hump and get to that national championship. And this was at a pep rally for the University of Georgia after Georgia had assigned its cost of attendance stipend. That is, its financial aid office, independently of the athletics department. Then they determined this number, and Mark Richt goes out and said, "We've been very creative in getting our number to a good spot." He's deliberately saying we're manipulating the cost of attendance stipend. Mark Richt was also very active in getting some other things that college football players like. Like he wanted an indoor practice facility. So he worked very hard to get things that were going to attract students that would involve the university spending money, but not actually paying students. And just so you know, I don't think coaches are the bad guys here. A lot of these coaches want their players to be paid. Steve Spurrier at South Carolina openly said we need to be paying our players. But these are the incentives here. This is the only opportunity they have under the rules. Nick Saban, his statement was a little bit funnier. Alabama, when they first announced their cost of attendance stipends that were coming out for the year, Auburn's was almost twice what Alabama was paid. And so he was asked about this, and at the news conference he said, "I think people have been manipulating this to get people to come here." And you can see the full quote right here. That's not the spirit of the rule. Poor Nick Saban, poor Alabama. I mean, how can they compete? And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, their number comes out that's 40% higher than the original number. You cannot tell me that was determined independently. Recently this year, Georgia was talking about it again, and you know who appeared at the press conference to discuss it? Greg McGarity, Georgia's athletic director. What on earth does he have to do with cost of attendance stipends? Clearly, these guys think it matters. So that's what these things are. Let's take a look at some of these numbers here I want to point out to you and point out a few of them here. So what I've done, and I don't know how well you can see, I hope these are big enough for you. It's hard to fit all this on the screen. I was able to get data for 113 of these schools. Some schools like MTSU just did not report the number. You can go and look on the website, and you can actually look at MTSU's cost of attendance, but they don't tell you if they give it to athletes or not. So I can look up the number for MTSU, and I think that number for travel and miscellaneous is about, I want to say it was close to $5,000, depending how you want to weight it. And to get their number. So you look up here at Conference USA. Let's see if I can get the laser. So Conference USA is right here. Minimum amount of the stipend, $0. Some people in the conference aren't giving, range from, the middle number was $1,000. The average stipend in Conference USA is $2,223. The maximum is $4,500. The school that's doing that is, I looked it up right before I came here and it just completely slipped my mind. Wait, maybe I wrote it on the slide. Florida Atlantic. I did. That's why you write things down. Okay. So Florida Atlantic is paying that much of the stipend. As I said here earlier, is that the coach actually said, I'm going to not take my $100,000 raise to help get cost of attendance. If you're thinking about going to MTSU or Florida Atlantic, are you going to look at everything about the school and not look at the money? You're probably going to be paying attention to that money too. You do care about the playing time. You do care about some things, other things. And so the average stipend here for all schools is about $3,500. Ranges from $7,000 down to $0. And the spread, obviously, the standard deviation of stipends is about $1,600. So, and the highest stipend up here, if you take a look at this, I know it's a lot to look at right here. The American Athletic Conference has that maximum stipend. Anyone guess what school that is? University of Cincinnati. Cincinnati. Now think about this. Cincinnati is not in the Power Five. It's in the next group of five. I can't remember what they call them. They decided to generate their own five. They're the B group, second grade group. They're the Beta Club, right? Not the Honor Society. And so with the American Athletic Conference, those are not really, you think of the sort of the prime football schools, but they're good enough schools to where you get good players, you have good fans coming to the game, and some of those players do go on to play in the NFL. So let's say you're thinking about going to the University of Alabama, and Nick Saban comes to you and said, son, I really want you to come play at Alabama. I can promise you a scholarship. By your junior year, I think I can get you some reps, some good honest reps. And our cost of attendance stipend is $5,000 a year, $5,600 a year. Coach at Cincinnati said, look, you're going to be the starter and I'm going to pay you $7,000. That's something extra that Cincinnati can offer. In fact, if you look at who's paying the most, the Southeastern Conference actually is number one in terms of average stipend, if you look at the mean. Number two is the American Athletic Conference. More than the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Big Ten, Big 12, and Pac-12. So on the margin, these are schools that say, we can't offer the tradition of Alabama, we can't offer SEC football, but maybe you can come play for us. And think about this. Let's say you have a player who's good enough to go play at an SEC school. And they're thinking about, I want to play with the best. I want to go to Alabama. But maybe Mississippi State's offering a little bit more money. Starkville's not as nice a place as Auburn is. And they did once throw Johnny Cash in jail for picking daisies. Those things like that happen in Starkville. But, you pay a little bit more money, maybe it's worth it. And you might think about, well, really, what's the difference in stipends between those two places? About $1,000? It doesn't seem like much money. But wouldn't you like to have $1,000 right now? You can do a lot with $1,000, especially when you're a college student, right? That's a lot of 12 packs of cheap beer, right? You think about what you could be doing with that, or maybe you had some other pursuits. You want to put it in a CD, or pay loans down in your car, whatever you might be doing. In terms of the Power 5 schools, they are paying a little bit more than the non-Power 5 schools. The average is about $3,700, although the max is up to $6,000, so about $1,000 less than what Cincinnati is offering, and the non-Power 5 is about $1,000 less, so not much different. You should also know that there's some other constraints here. Most of these schools, because of Title IX implications, give cost of attendance stipends to every student athlete. So you're not just paying your 85 scholarship football players cost of attendance, you're also paying all your women's college basketball players as well as your men's college basketball players and your women's track team, your men's track team. For they're afraid of violating federal regulations. So it's not just finding money to pay cost of attendance stipends to your players, you've got to find it to pay cost of attendance stipends to all these other people who are in sports that aren't generating much revenue to the school at all. So that's revenue that's going to non-revenue sports instead of to the players in the sports that are generating that amount of revenue. Now, one thing I forgot to mention here when I was talking about the manipulation of revenue, I want to go back here. I'm going to come back to it. So here I talk about here how you can use travel and miscellaneous expenses to generate cost of attendance, how much it costs to go to school. So if you go and you look on the website for MTSU, you're going to say what they expect it's going to cost you in travel. Well, I don't know the actual formula they used at MTSU, but I did look at some other schools. So if you go to the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, doesn't matter where you live. If you live in-state in Tennessee, they're going to assume that you're going to take 3 round-trip driving trips to which Tennessee city do you think? If you're trying to manipulate this, what city are you going to pick? From Knoxville to Memphis, right? 800-mile round trip. 3 of them. You might live in Murfreesboro. You might live in Knoxville, but guess what? You get that same cost of attendance amount. University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. 4 round trips to Warner Robins, Georgia. Why on earth would anyone want to go to Warner Robins, Georgia? Well, I mean, you're from there. I don't mean to insult the place. Just a little bit south of Macon. But 4 of them. You got to go. In Tennessee, I guess people in Tennessee only go home 3 times. In Georgia, it's 4. A little bit further away. If I was working for Georgia, I would pick Valdosta because that's really far away from Athens. And also, but keep the 4 trips. And in terms of, and actually, Georgia also has to pick for out-of-state students. Cost of attendance is sometimes different for out-of-state students. And just so you know, these numbers up here that I had are the out-of-state numbers. I was trying to show the numbers as high as they could be because I think that's what these programs are often doing. In Georgia, it assumes that you take a round-trip ticket to Chicago, plane ticket to Chicago. So you live in South Carolina, you go play at Georgia, here's a round-trip ticket to Chicago. You don't get the actual ticket. Just you get the amount of money, cash money, that you could have used for that. Also, Georgia has a communications allowance under miscellaneous. I don't know what that is. But it's very interesting that a lot of athletic directors, when they were talking about this in the off-season, they were asking about cost of attendance stipends, and they said, you know, we're upset that our students aren't spending money on the right things. They're spending them on hoverboards, and they're spending them on rims and tattoos. I'm not making it up. That was a quote. The athletic director at Alabama said, I'm tired of our athletes spending money on rims and tattoos. He actually said that. Number one, is it any more frivolous than anything we spend our money on? You know, how many of those athletic directors were buying fancy luxury cars that they didn't need? You know, what do you want to do? Oh, you get money in your kid, you got to put it in the stock market, you got to put it in a bank account? Why do we spend money to make us happier? What's wrong with this? And so there have been a lot of complaints about players who are spending money on video game machines, and I certainly, probably spending money on a video game machine was probably I got more value out of that in college than anything else. You know, it's a lot of fun times doing that. But my point is that that's how easy it is to manipulate this. The financial aid office just says, oh, you know, we've got a formula behind it, and there's no one really checking up on it. But it also applies to every other student at the university, even non-athletes. And that can create some problems. Now, let me jump back ahead here to these numbers here. I want to show you how I wanted to estimate the impact of the cost of attendance stipend amounts that these students are getting and the decision for players to go to these individual schools. Now, what I did is I generated a little empirical model here, and let me just sort of tell you about what it was. I wanted to look at the recruiting ranking of a school in 2015. And like most economic studies you'll say, well, why are you looking at only 1 year? Shouldn't you look at many years? This was just implemented last year. I don't even know if it's going to survive a court challenge to be around next year. Also, it's policy relevant. I just wanted to see it, so I've got a 1-year snapshot of recruiting rankings of each schools. Now, these recruiting rankings are done by several different organizations, but the one I'm going to use is Rivals.com. And you can go to their website. Yahoo has bought the rights to use Rivals information. It's really quite neat. There seems to be a high correlation between the quality of recruits in terms of how good they can play football and these recruiting rankings. But it's something we can look at tangible and say, these schools are getting the best students. Now, it might be in 3 years that the schools of the highest recruiting ranking are winning more, and past studies have shown that. But right now, I want to know how did the 2015 rankings affect these students' decisions to go to schools. So, cost of attendance numbers that are being paid out in terms of stipends, you can't just go to websites and look at how much it is. You have to see if they actually paid students. And 3 organizations last year did surveys. The Chronicle of Higher Education did a survey which was done in the early summer when a lot of the numbers weren't set yet. So their numbers weren't as quite as good. But their numbers were also good because they were able to get numbers from schools like Duke and the University of Miami who were private schools and weren't releasing their data. So we wouldn't have known what Duke or Miami were paying if we didn't have access to these other databases. Also, CBS Sports and USA Today had more extensive databases. CBS's is really the most extensive. And their numbers actually are not all identical. And that's because different people reported it at schools. So what I did was I went and I looked at the rankings separately. And I also looked at every single ranking and took the highest number that you could pay a student to see how that might have affected a student's decision to go to schools and thus look at the recruiting ranking. And that is, if students are going, if the stipend is high, we should see the recruiting ranking go down because remember, a negative ranking is good. You want to be number 1. You don't want to be number 129. So we can look at these ranking numbers. And now let's look at some other things that also might be affecting student decisions to go to school. And if you're familiar with econometrics, you may not have had a class in that yet, or multiple regression analysis, we need to have some control variables in the model. We need to say, what are some other factors that might affect a student's decision to go to a school? Because obviously, a stipend just isn't enough. We didn't see every recruit in the country want to go to the University of Cincinnati. Still, plenty of athletes wanted to go to Alabama. There are many attributes that are there. They might have just a better football tradition. They're more likely to get access to scouts. You get to work with Nick Saban. Isn't that wonderful? There are a lot of things that Alabama can offer and other schools can offer that Cincinnati can't. But what we're going to try and look at is, on the margin, does this money make a difference? I also looked at the recruiting ranking of the previous year. That should tell us something about when stipends weren't offered, how good were these schools at attracting talent? So that's a big factor that's going to pick up a lot of these unincluded factors in the regression model. I'm going to look at what conference you were in. So we're going to expect better players to want to go to better conferences, and that's not surprising. Look at how were their performance in the past. What was your winning percentage over the past 5 years? How many conference championships you won? And how many top 25 finishes have you had? If you want to go play for a winning team, not just have a good record, but maybe winning some championships or being seen in the polls, those are some things that might attract you, especially if you want to play in the NFL. If you're playing for good teams, scouts are going to see you. This is going to be attractive for me. Plus, isn't it fun to play for a winning team? You're probably going to go to a bowl game. These are some amenities you're looking for, not just cash. Revenues that school have. I also looked at the revenues at the school, the average revenues of football programs had generated for the previous 5 years. That shows what type of money the program might have to wine and dine students without actually giving them money. So let's build you nicer dorms. We're going to have better practice facilities. We're going to hire better coaches. These are things that you can do with that football revenue. So we're trying to pick up how much money could these programs be spending to bring students here without actually directly paying them. It's funny how schools seem to go out of the way to do everything but try and pay the players to get them to come. How about the quality of the school? So we used the freshman math score. We could have used other variables, but my co-author, who's done a lot more work with this, says math seems to work the best. Higher math score, the better students you're getting. If you go to a school with a better academic reputation, your diploma is going to be a little bit more valuable. So that could attract students. Head coaching experience. You've had a coach who's been there for a long time. That's someone who's experienced in recruiting, good at getting players, and also is a name. So it's not someone who's just a new coach. And we actually looked at a lot of other factors, but we left the ones in the model that seemed to best explain the recruiting rankings, and it didn't really affect the main variable of interest we were looking at, is that how much the stipends were affecting the recruiting ranking. And I used a simple ordinary least squares regression model, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry about it. Basically what we're trying to do is let's see what happened to the recruiting ranking when stipends went up, taking into account all these other factors. So, and these numbers are a little bit hard to see up here, but if you look at the big numbers, they sort of give you an idea of what's going on. Basically, every $1,000 increase in your cost of attendance stipend increases your ranking or decreases your ranking by 2 to 4 spots, depending on which model I use. And I use a lot of different models. Or if you want to put it another way, between every $230 and every $483 you spend, that improves your ranking by 1 place. Now think about this. Think about you're an athletic director, you're a coach, and you're out there going, look, if I had another $500 for every player here, we'd get a better class. Okay. This is one of those studies that I did as an economist. The numbers came out and I said, oh, this is too cute, I've got to do this study. And I knew that I was going to put all the numbers in and nothing was going to work. And I was just going to, it's going to be wasted effort. I couldn't get this result to go away. I mean, my co-author and I were stunned at this. We were like, we must be just doing something wrong. It's actually, our hypothesis is correct, it seems. But basically, yes, we're finding that college athletes are going to schools where they're getting paid more, at least as it's reflected in the 2015 ranking of recruits. So it seemed to be pretty clear, and I know this is a lot of statistical gobbledygook up here, but the main thing I just wanted to show you where those numbers come from and that they were quite robust and they were pretty strong. But if you just remember that every $1,000 you spend on a stipend, which is about 1 standard deviation, improves your ranking by 2 to 4 spots. Now, for practical purposes, what does that mean? So let's take a look at 4 comparison institutions. And because I'm in Georgia, and it provided a real nice dichotomy here because you have some in-state rivals in Florida and Georgia that are in different conferences that are also rivals with each other. So Georgia and Florida are huge rivals in the same conference, even though they're in different states. Georgia Tech and Florida State are ACC rivals, maybe not quite to the level of Georgia and Florida, but also in-state Georgia and Georgia Tech are rivals, and Florida State are in-state rivals. So up here I have the stipend amount. So Georgia, its stipend last year was about $3,700. Tech's was $2,000. That would mean that Georgia's ranking was 4 rankings better than Georgia Tech's in terms of its recruiting rankings based on these estimates. That is, that's 4 places of difference. How about look at Georgia Tech and Florida State? $6,000 Florida State, Georgia Tech $2,000. That's a 10-place difference in recruiting ranking. And so you can look at the ranks as to where they are. So Georgia Tech is at a huge recruiting disadvantage to Florida State. Now, of course, it was very inconvenient after I wrote this paper that Georgia Tech ended up beating Florida State last year in football. I was really, really rooting hard for this to happen, even though my sister went to Tech. But this just shows you, and again, it's not necessarily the results on the field, but think about this. Think about Kirby Smart going to the legislature in Georgia and going, I need FOIA request extended from 3 days to 90 days, drop of a hat, done. How about constituents looking at how on earth is our recruiting ranking so much worse than Florida State? So if you're at Georgia, we need to up our number. And all schools are going to be saying this. Florida's going to be saying that. Well, Georgia's is going up and so is Florida State's. Well, we're going to leave that all to the financial aid office. The financial aid office, which came up with such wonderful numbers for travel and miscellaneous. So your communications package, your round-trip ticket to Chicago, your 3 trips a year to Memphis from Knoxville, Tennessee. So that's where this is coming from. So it does have an effect. Now, in reality, though, what does this mean in a sense? I mean, most economists are going to say, duh, people, you pay them more, they're going to go to the job where they're paid more. I mean, think about that. You're going to go work at 2 jobs, and you're trying to think about which job you want to work at. You want to work at Pizza Hut or Domino's? Domino's says we pay $10 an hour. Pizza Hut says we pay $15 an hour. I'm going to go work at Pizza Hut, right? This is the same thing with college football. This shouldn't be surprising. But what it does raise is getting back to the issue of why we have these cost of attendance stipends in the first place. And that is, let's take a look at how much revenue is being generated and how much college football players are getting back from these stipends. So this chart is a little bit intimidating, but I wanted to get all these numbers on here to show you. I wanted to take a look at revenue. Over here in this column, I have the average team revenue of the NFL for the last season, that was reported, which was 2014. The average NFL team was about $347 million. The Tennessee Titans were about about 320, if you're curious. And in fact, the median is actually a little bit lower than that because the Cowboys and Patriots earn so much more than everyone else. The Cowboys' revenue is about over $600 million. They have a stadium that can generate more revenue and a huge fan base as well. So they have 53 players on the team, and their salary cap number is $143 million. That was the salary cap last year. So no team could spend more than that, and it's possible to spend more than that with some exceptions, but let's just keep the cap as a good number. With 53 players, that's an average salary of $2.7 million. And just so you know, that number, if you look at some numbers, you'll see a little bit less. There are some practice squad players who are included in this, but just for simple analysis, I wanted to keep the roster size the same. Over $2 million is what the average NFL player is being paid. That's about 41% of team revenue goes to paying player salaries. NFL football, college football, very similar. Yes, the competition is a little bit different. And in fact, let's look at revenue. So the top 5 FBS schools earn about $95 million. And in fact, this is underestimating the revenue they're taking in. If we took 41% of that number, like NFL players are being paid, and gave it to the players and distributed it out among 85 player scholarships. Now, I understand that college football teams are often larger than the scholarship players, but again, let's just keep this simple. So we're going to just pay a salary to 85 scholarship football players. That's going to generate an average salary of $461,000 if they get the revenue share like NFL players get. So let's just take a look. So let's just take the tuition. I just went ahead and just about $35,000 is pretty typical for tuition, room, and board. I think I actually got that off the MTSU website, about $35,000. Cost of attendance, the most expensive one. Then I'm going to give players $7,000 back in a stipend. So I'm going to give them the highest amount possible. And just, these numbers are all in millions if you wonder why the decimals are like that. And then, so I'm going to estimate what I call an exploitation value. And I put that in quotes because, what do we mean by exploitation? Basically just saying, how much less is a player making than their average marginal revenue product that I'm estimating here? It's a little bit confusing to use average and marginal here. But what I'm saying is that, on average, a player we'd expect to get paid $461,000. I'm going to count the fact that they get a scholarship of $35,000. If someone gives you $35,000 in cash or a $35,000 scholarship, which one's more valuable to you? Cash, right? Because you can always just buy the scholarship. So I'm really even overstating it. In fact, a lot of college football players don't want the scholarship. They don't want to go to class. And look at all the scandals we've had with fake classes at universities that have great reputations, academic reputations, like University of North Carolina. I grew up in North Carolina and tell you that everyone who went to that school will tell you how wonderful it is all day long. My father went to Duke, so it was especially painful for me to hear. But anyway, there's athletes themselves don't even necessarily want that scholarship. But I'm even giving credit. That means that of that, if we'd expect them to get $461,000, they're only getting $419,000 is going back to the school. They're only getting $42,000 worth. So as a percent, that's about 91% of what we would expect them to get. And these are just top 5 FBS schools. It's interesting that some of the early studies of the exploitation of Major League Baseball players prior to free agency, Gerald Scully in 1974 did a famous paper looking at baseball players before the advent of free agency and said, how much revenue would they be generating per player, and then how much do they actually get in terms of salary? He estimated their marginal revenue product and what they were getting, and he found out they were getting about 10% of their marginal revenue product. This is pretty on par with that, and I actually didn't even notice that when I initially did this. So this is a pretty big amount. So you might say, well, look, and I've seen this. If you go look on Twitter and someone's talking about cost of attendance, they're like, well, students are getting cost of attendance. They are getting paid. In fact, they're getting paid too much. But if we look at how NFL players are paid, they're shorted by about $400,000. How about top 20 schools? Their average revenue is about $75 million. We break that down. Their extraction or exploitation value is about a little bit over $300,000. Average SEC school player, exploitation about $220,000. So can you imagine, if you were at an SEC school, you were playing for Auburn, $262,000. Isn't that about what Cam Newton's dad got paid right there? SEC school? Probably going to get in trouble. I have a lot of Auburn friends. I like Auburn. Just happen to notice the numbers about the same. Power 5 schools, about $200,000. Again, the extraction that's being taken or being kept by the college institution. And all FBS schools. And remember here, I'm giving every school that maximum stipend, just out of the kindness of my heart to see what would happen. You see how small that number is. Still, on average, their value in terms of what the NFL players are paid is about $131,000. So that's about $90,000 that is kept by the colleges that are employing these players. My point here is again, these are fun numbers that I'm playing around with, but it just shows you how much revenue is being earned and how very little is being given back to players. What have we demonstrated in this study? One of the things that I found was, do the cost of attendance allowances affect where players are going to school? Absolutely yes. So when someone says, look, I am diehard MTSU fan. I'm going to MTSU because that's where my heart is. And someone says, look, I'll give you $3,000 to come play for us, or how about Florida Atlantic? I'll give you $6,000. See you later, MTSU. That's the type of thing that can happen. And this isn't surprising. Employees move to where they're the most highly valued. And obviously there are other factors that are involved. Very few people if you're going to be a star quarterback at the University of Alabama, you probably don't want to go to the University of Cincinnati, even though they're going to pay you a little bit more. You're going to get more prestige. It's going to be more fun. You're going to get to play for a great coach, maybe win a national championship. Those things are more likely, but all you're maybe giving up is $2,000. But for some of those marginal players, it can make a pretty big difference for them, particularly if they're going to get more playing time. So obviously this isn't surprising. Now, one of the big things I want to point out here is implications for other students. The implication here is that the cost of attendance was never developed to have anything to do with athletes. It was a mechanism that the NCAA used to try and institute paying players more. So you might think it's better. Let's say the cost of attendance goes up at MTSU. You're like, great, I can take out more loans. Well, how does future you going to feel about it? You know, I took out loans that I didn't really need. Or how about you get a scholarship? You give someone a full academic scholarship because that person is good academically. And you go back to the foundation that gives the scholarship and say, you got to cough up some extra money here because our full cost of attendance has gone up. So it's affecting a whole class of students that it wasn't designed to affect for the benefit of a very small few. Now, I also want to point out, what the implications here are for athletes. So if you are a football player and you're getting paid this very small amount, where's all this surplus going? If the school is generating $95 million, where's the rest of that money going if so very little of it is going to cover all these costs of attendance stipends? Well, Nick Saban recently said in a recent unauthorized biography of his, he said, look, I'm not really that good a coach. What I am is a great recruiter. Now, I don't buy that, although I do think he's a great recruiter. He's well known for going in and talking people into coming to Alabama. So let's say someone is willing to come play for the University of Alabama, and you can't pay them $300,000 that they might be worth to your institution. But Nick Saban can convince that person. Who do you give that $300,000 to? Nick Saban. So a lot of the value that is being generated by players is being given by people who are indirectly responsible for bringing them there to provide their services to the school, to be an excellent football player. And if you look around at college football coaching salaries, you'll see that oftentimes they're higher than NFL counterparts. Same with college basketball. Why is this? Because, and the revenues in college basketball and college football are much less than in the pros. But they're still paying them more because if you can't pay the player, pay the person who can get them there. You don't really care. So a lot of that value is being handed off to coaches, and I think a perfect example is on the campus we're standing in right now. The coach of your football team says, I can't get players to come here. I need to pay them to come here. That's implicitly what he is saying. So anyway here, I just wanted to bring up some of these ideas here in regards to you and talk to you about this in viewing college football as a business. I said I'd talk for an hour, then take questions, and that's about where we're at. So I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Let me ask
Sure,
one
Jason.
here. So I was really interested to see that Cincinnati had the highest cost of
Attendance, yeah.
attendance, right? And so one interesting thing would be, and kind of the econometric way to do this, right, is interact the conference dummy with the cost of attendance amount, right? Do you have a varying effect of that cost of attendance by conference, like those kind
Right.
of outsiders? So, once you're outside of those big five conferences, do you have a larger effect? Is kind of the marginal dollar?
Right. So that's a way to get more directly at if these factors are more important. I don't know that we tried that, but that's an interesting econometric approach.
Does that kind of relationship hold for other schools like, I don't know, Louisville or something similar to Cincinnati, where you're kind of outside the big conferences, but you're still kind of a
Right.
thought of program?
Off the top of my, it's been a while since I looked at the exact data, so I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I would not be surprised. And if you looked at the entire All-American Conference, those had the highest numbers. In fact, really the SEC was the only one who could compete. And so I think it's funny that they're not even the ones who were pushing for it. Yes.
Is the stipend just like a fraction of that cost of attendance that's been on the website forever, or is the formula, I guess, for that something that they could just come up with sort of on the fly, basically? I guess how related are those formulas, and how much room did they have to come up with one that gave them the highest number, I guess?
Well, and they have to be able to defend it. And so, when you look at what they have to defend, we wanted to pick a place central United States, so we pick a round trip to Chicago. That doesn't make a lot of sense. They can also adjust that number to, let's say you have someone who lives on the West Coast. They can actually go and give that person a little bit more and justify it. But for the most part, they just have to have some sort of what they consider a reasonable estimate. And when you look at cost of attendance numbers jumping. Like for Alabama's, it jumped 40%.
The whole cost of attendance jumped 40%? Like,
No, the amount of stipend that they could pay. And so, no, it's not, yeah, let me clarify that. So what's going on here is that they've always been able to pay this amount up here. So that $35,000 I had in that chart was that, oops. So it's only the travel and miscellaneous. So they have to have it separated out. And it normally is on most websites actually separated out. And so this is the place where they can do the manipulation. And so if you want to do travel, let's try and get that distance very far in the most expensive way possible. Maybe have them take Amtrak. That's more expensive than anything, right?
so would it be theoretically possible to see which universities, say the Tennessee example, if Tennessee, it was Nashville in 2014, they changed it to Memphis in 2015 expressly for that purpose. Is it possible, I guess, to see which universities are sort of seemingly, kind of gaming the system?
Right. And the problem is it's a lot of legwork, and also the schools are not very helpful. They don't want to put these numbers out there, and it's not even so much about transparency because they don't want researchers to see it. And I think most of the people involved, although they don't say it, they know it matters. They'll say the exact opposite. But I think it's more they don't want the rivals to see what they're doing. Georgia doesn't want Florida to know what it's doing. So this was very secretive, and I think that was the most interesting thing I found about doing this study is that I initially found the USA Today database. So, this is great. And then I found the CBS one. I said, oh, good. And I'm like, these aren't matching up. Now, the correlations I didn't put up here were about 90%. And then I found the Chronicle of Higher Education one, and its correlation coefficient was in the 60s. So it was a little bit less. But they're not the same. That means someone at the school is giving different numbers out. And so it's not out there officially. And the SEC is saying, well, you have to report these numbers, but pretty much for labor law reasons or antitrust reasons, they really can't collude on that. So really no one has a good grasp on this, and the NCAA doesn't want to ask and require it because they're facing antitrust scrutiny. So it's the Wild West out there.
Just a question about, you have the totals for sort of dividing by the 85 scholarship football players. What does that look like if you include all of the athletes who are covered by school?
Right, so that
schools cover everyone, whether you're a revenue generating sport or not.
Well, exactly, but I would consider that revenue that's being shifted to the college off the players. And so you're absolutely right that, I can say, well, look, some students are getting it, so it's going to go to the women's golf team. That some of that money is going to go to them. So I should be clear in saying it doesn't necessarily mean it's going back to the university to do whatever they want. The president doesn't put it in a swimming pool and swim around in it. It is going to other places. But yeah, so I should make that more clear. But still, I think the point is it's not going to them. And I think it's one of the more interesting things is the fact that when they first started the stipends, the initial thing was, no, for Title IX reasons, we don't have to give out cost of attendance. And before you know it, all the attorneys were saying, no, you have to start giving it to everyone. And who can afford that? The biggest schools. And I think that's a big challenge for a school like MTSU with a lot of athletic programs and doesn't have the athletic donor support. It's very easy, and especially since you don't have to pay the players, well, let's just pay some of the other athletes in non-revenue generating sports. Yes?
What other schools in Conference USA do the stipends?
I was looking at that. It's about half do and half don't. So Florida Atlantic was the most, and I believe theirs was close to $6,000. And UNC Charlotte's back in they're in Conference USA, right? They just started a football team, and they were paying about $2,000. I just am not as familiar with the conference. If you name some schools, I might be able to remember it off the top of my head, but I just can't remember it right now. I should have printed it out and brought it with me.
Except I don't believe Rice has a football team, do they?
Oh yes, they have a football team, but I don't think Rice. I think Rice is one of those that did not report. A lot of the private institutions did not report it. So, but really, I would say it was about half the schools, and most of the schools in the conference, other than Florida Atlantic, it was more about like $2,000.
So here's just a kind of question going forward. I mean, do you see this expanding where there's more explicit pay of athletes with like the O'Bannon case, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, yeah, it's all going to come down to what happens with the O'Bannon case, and it'll go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it'll be decided by whether 8 or 9 people. I'm not sure at this point.
And if that's ruled in O'Bannon's favor, does that just cover royalties later, or that then would allow payment while the students are in attendance?
You know, it's very unclear, and Judge Wilkin, who ruled on the case, really took a lot of leeway with what she did, and people were very shocked, sort of. You know, she basically said, well, because some expert said, I think the number's about $5,000. She's like, well, we have to have a trust fund of at least $5,000 or no more than $5,000. No one can figure out what it is. And that part of the judgment was withheld, said, no, you don't have to do that yet. And Supreme Court may uphold that. It'll probably be remanded back to figure out some way. But if they find that the NCAA has this cartel and is creating these issues, it could open the floodgates for just paying players straight out without even having to go through further lawsuits. I doubt that's the case. I mean, my guess is that what's going to be decided here is, you know, yes, you have some market power issues. You're going to have to pay these players for it. But here's the thing that's very interesting when you look at the judicial history of sports. Judges bend over backwards to support sports. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. I mean, when you look at the Federal League, the Supreme Court decision with the Federal League challenging Major League Baseball, and the baseball's antitrust exemption. I mean, they basically said, yeah, this is clearly a monopoly, but we like baseball and we don't want it to go away. I mean, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was absolutely going to rule against Major League Baseball, basically, and he withheld his ruling for like a year and a half, until finally the Federal League dropped its suit, and he said, yeah, I didn't want to rule on that because I thought it would ruin baseball. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. Yes?
I saw a video online, I can't remember what it was or where it was, but it was basically, someone put it together, I don't know if it's going to be a documentary soon or what it was, but it was basically explaining how college athletics, the burden's actually going on the students, and the students are paying for all of it. And they put out all these numbers, and I felt like your presentation was kind of the counter argument to that. I'm not sure if you heard anything like that, or maybe what you're taking.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, a large part of the burden of who's paying for athletics, really. I mean, some of it, obviously, at the big universities, you have donors who are donating to the foundation that are paying a lot of the coaches' salaries. But most of these programs, in terms of the revenue they generate from ticket sales and television revenue, radio revenue, isn't sufficient to cover the cost of operation. And where that's made up is mostly out of student fees. So if you go and look at your own student fees, you'll see an athletic fee there. And so you definitely would be bearing much of the burden of that at a school like MTSU. So I'm not sure, there's a program, I think there's one on Netflix that someone has pointed out to me, and that may be the one you're
It
talking
might have
about.
been a preview for that, yeah. I just thought it was interesting because it kind of put things in perspective a little bit, but it's...
Well, but think about this. Does anyone know how much your athletic fee is? Now, I mean, do you like that you have a football team? I mean, if you look at the athletic fee, let's say it's like $200 a semester. Do you value paying $200 a semester for a football team? For some people you might, some people you might not. I mean, I think that students do like paying for it a lot, but I think the reality is that a lot of us, you're paying so many fees, you're not even paying attention. But that is a big issue, is that just because you're losing money doesn't mean students don't want it. And schools are adding football teams all the time. Why does Division III Swanee still have a football team? I taught there for 5 years. I went to maybe one football game the entire time, and that's more than most people. But they have it. They feel it's important for tradition and it keeps people involved. And when alums come back for homecoming, that's when they come back there and money falls out of their pockets. So I think that's part of the reason why they continue to have the football team. And I do think that students do enjoy that. Yeah.
Did you know that Swanee also recently bought like a NASCAR team?
Swanee did?
Yeah.
I did not know that. Interesting.
They came to like 20th on their first race.
Really? That's not the demographic they're normally shooting for.
Pretty crazy.
Did you?
All right, well, let's thank Dr. Bradbury.
Thank you.